Hello friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Olaoluwa Fajimi. I'm a portfolio GP and training program director in Coventry. In the last couple of weeks, I've received a lot of questions from colleagues bordering on the 14 fish portfolio. And in response to that, I've decided to do a series of video to describe the use of the 14 fish portfolio. In today's video, I'm going to be focusing on an overview of all the functionalities of the 14 fish portfolio. And I'm going to start from the left hand side where we've got the learning logs. In terms of how you put in your learning log, it can be done in two ways. First is that you can click on new entry and then select the specific learning log you want to put in. And second, you can just go straight to the learning log you want to put in, click on it, and get started. As you can see, the first is the clinical case review. Your clinical case review is where you put in all patient encounters that you want to reflect upon. Once you've seen a patient and you think it's a case where you've learned a lot, or it's a case that provides a lot of opportunities for learning, or a case that has provoked a lot of emotions in you, and you want to reflect on it, then your clinical case review is where to go into. And once you go into your clinical case review and you click upon it, then it will then give you the chance to put in a title, to put in a setting, a brief description, and to select two clinical experience groups and two capabilities. And then you will have the chance to reflect on it and the chance to mention the learning needs you've identified. Please watch out for my video on writing a log entry where I will write a couple of log entries for you to see so that you can see how the thought process is like when you're trying to write a log entry. And once you've written your clinical case review, you then send it to your educational supervisor. Your supporting documentation or your CPD is where you put in everything that is about your CPD. If you've attended the conference, you've attended the teaching, you've read a book, you've read specific topics, and you've got evidence that you've read those things or you've done those things, then they all go into your supporting documentation. Every documentation, apart from those that are already captured in your compliance passport, which I will talk about very soon, are to go into your supporting documentation. The next one is your learning event analysis and your significant event analysis. If you've seen a patient and for any reason whatsoever, the patient was then discussed in the wider team, let's say the patient has made a complaint or there is a bad outcome that has happened to the patient such that they needed to be discussed, and you have learned a lot from this, then this is where you put that entry. Now, there is a need to make a difference between your significant event analysis and your learning event analysis. Now, if there is potential or actual harm to the patient, that will meet the GMC's threshold and that will be a significant event. If it is less than that, but it's something you've learned a lot from, then that will be your learning event analysis. If it's a significant event analysis, you will also need to mention it in your Form R, which we will talk about in just a moment. The next is your reflection on feedback. Your reflection on feedback is where you put all reflection following feedback that you've received from patients, from colleagues, from your CS, your ES, your TPD, or anyone that is part of your training. Your leadership, management, and professionalism is the place where you put in things you've done about leadership. If you've noticed something, let's say you've done an audit and the audit is not captured in your KIA or your QIP, it comes in here. If you've given a presentation and the presentation has led to a change of how people do things, then it will come in here as well. Your quality improvement activity, which you need two of before you CCT. And any year you're doing a QIA, you do not need to do a QIP. And the common question is always what constitutes a QIA and what constitutes a QIP. Now, if you've noticed things in your own personal practice and you want to change it, and it's limited to you, and you've done things to change it and you've measured it and you've indeed noticed changes in it, then that will be a QIA. If that thing applies to the wider organization, for instance, if you've noticed that patients who have been started on some anti-seizure medication, for instance, some anti-epileptic medications, are not being cancelled on contraception, and you wanted to change that, and you've measured that, and you've noticed that that is indeed very poor, and you wanted to change that, and you've you've placed measures in place to change that, and you've measured it after to see that what you've done has actually led to an improvement within the wider team, that will be a QIP. What the GMC stipulates is that there must be some sort of quality improvement every year. So when you have done a QIP in a clinical year, you do not need to do a QIA. The next is your prescribing, which you do in step 3, which you go back to your last few prescriptions to assess them, and you send them to your supervisor, who then assesses that and then be able to grade you on that. The next is your clinical examination and procedural skills KEPS. KEPS can be divided into two. They can be mandatory, they can be non-mandatory. The mandatory ones are those listed in there. And when you've done those, before you CCT, you need them to be assessed as competent to perform the procedure unsupervised. Once you've done a KEPS and a senior, usually ST4 and above, has observed you doing a KEPS, you will request the KEPS assessment in here, and they will be able to assess you and be able to grade you. As far as the non-mandatory ones are concerned, the word non-mandatory almost connotes that, oh, it's not necessary. That is not the case. In fact, the college wants a wide range of non-mandatory ones. So don't look at doing one, do as many as you can. And again, to CCT, they will need to be signed off as competent to perform the procedure unsupervised. Don't forget, as far as your KEPs are concerned, you will need to send it, the ticket, to your supervisor. Your placement planning meeting is where you will log that discussion you have with your clinical supervisor at the beginning of the placement. At the beginning of the placement, to see what learning opportunities are available to you in that placement, and to see and set the tone for that placement. Like I mentioned, it needs to be entered by yourself once that meeting takes place. The next one is academic activity, which is the tool that is used by academic GP trainees. So if you're not an academic trainee, you do not need to bother yourself at all about this area. Now, the next section is the ESR preparation, and in the ESR preparation, we've got the capability areas and the clinical experience group areas. The capability areas, as you can see, they are in gray lozenges, and the clinical experience group areas in green lozenges. Once you are making your log entries, sending them to your supervisor, remember I showed you that you've got to choose capability areas and you've got to choose clinical experience group areas and justify them, and your supervisor then marks you off. Then you gain one lozenge each, so such that when you're ready for your ESR, you should have all the areas completely filled up. So when you're in the last month or so running into your ESR, you're constantly looking where areas am I deficient in, and those are the ones you want to be writing on at that time. Now, there is one very important tool in the ESR preparation, which is the requirement. The requirement is the tool that tells us what are the minimum requirements of each of the things that we need to do. Don't forget these are minimum requirements. I will highly suggest that you plan to do more in each of the requirements. Plan to do more such that if anything happens, you know you have a good buffer and you have some extra things to fall back on. Then we've got the education assessment, and the education assessment has got the CBDs, which are the case based discussions. A CBD is a discussion you have with a senior, usually ST4 and above, about a case you have seen to discuss all the issues surrounding that case. They do not need to have seen you to have seen the case or to have performed an examination to do a CBD. So once you've done that and you've had that discussion and you've asked them if they're happy to complete a CBD for you, just send a request in here. Now, in ST3, we call it CART, and this will be enabled in ST3. And when you're not in primary care, perhaps in ST1 or 2, like in the hospital, then this will be the enabled one. You can see that this doctor is currently in primary care, which is why this is enabled. Then you send to your to the person whom you've discussed with, and they are able to give a feedback and grade you. Next one is your CSR, which is your clinical supervisor's review, which is the review you have with your clinical supervisor at the end of every rotation. So when you're coming to the end of your rotation, please be discussing with your clinical supervisor when you can sit down and have a review, as this is an important requirement for your ARCP. And next is the caps, which we've discussed about. Next is the prescribing, which we've discussed about. Next is the mini cakes, which we haven't discussed about. It's called the mini cakes in the hospital, but in the GP surgery, we call it cut or audio cut. And this is you being observed, seeing a patient, examining them, and formulating a management plan, and then discussing the whole of the of that process really with your supervisor after that. And based on that, they are able to rank you as to how you're doing. And then if you then wish to then reflect on that, you can do that at that clinical you can do that at that reflection on feedback that I showed you about earlier. And then the next thing is those caps, which before the caps we've got the QIP, which I've discussed with you earlier. Then we've got the caps, which again we've discussed earlier. And then you can put a caps reflection in here if you have a particularly challenging examination of a patient, or if you've seen a patient and what you were expecting to find is completely different from what you found, then here is when to call where to make that entry. The next is your compliance passport, which tells us the mandatory documents that need to be attached, and those are: number one, your form R, your BLS. Don't forget that your BLS is both adult and child plus AED, and then your adult and child safeguarding. Now, when you've done all of this, it's also important to do a reflection and then attach or link the reflection. And how to do that is, if you've done a log entry, for instance, and you are able to then come in here to link it to the mandatory training. Let's say this log entry is about a clinical scenario where you've used your knowledge of BLS and you want to link it. You just come in here and link it. Let's say this entry is about a child safeguarding situation which you have identified, and you are able to come in here to link it to show that not only have you done the adult or child safeguarding, you continue to use the knowledge and you continue to be aware of your local pathways as far as adult and child safeguarding are concerned. And then the last one on the left hand side is your timeout of training, which you need to enter yourself, which comes, you put in the date in here and the reason. But it's important to make sure that this timeout of training as declared in here is consistent to the one you've declared in your form her. Then we come to the right hand side of the portfolio and you've got your training map. Your training map is a very important tool that gives you an helicopter view of your training. It tells you where you are in your training. This doctor is writing here, for instance, and it tells you the date of your CCT. It also gives you the highlight of all the important happenings during the course of your training. You're going to find links to your ESR, to your CSR, to your multi-source feedbacks, to your ARCP panels, to your exams, and all important happenings within your training period. So your training map is a good place to come to get a brief summary of what's happening in your training. Then the second one, which is quite important, is your PDP, your personal development plan. Your PDP is your own plan after you have looked inward and you've identified gaps, and it's your own plan to fill those gaps and to enter a PDP entry. Just come in here and then add a PDP idea. You can add the idea and then you can save it, and that is how to enter a PDP. Please look forward to my video where I will make a few live PDP entries so that you know how to enter one. The next area will be the area where you can make your AKT reservation, and once you've reserved this or you're in ST3, then this section where you're able to reserve your SCA also becomes live. And then the next one is your multi-source feedback, where you're able to collect a patient feedback as you need in ST3, and you're able to invite colleagues for your multi-source feedback as you need once a year in ST1, 2, and 3. And then finally is your educator's notes, which is entered by educators who are involved in your GP training as your clinical supervisor, your educational supervisor, your TPD, your associate dean, your head of school can make entries in here. And when entries have been made in here, you're able to read it, but also you're able to then make reflections on those feedback using this place as I have shown you earlier. Friends, we have come to the end of this overview of your 14 fish portfolio. If you've liked the video and you've enjoyed it, please do well to subscribe, share with your friends, and make comments of questions that you want to ask, and I will be waiting for your questions so I can answer them. See you in my next video.